Again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this roundtable once again. My topic seems to be broad, but my context will be as a Filipino and as a Christian. And I want to dedicate this paper for those who have died and those who continue to suffer in this pandemic and this coronavirus crisis. My topic is about communicating salvation in the time of the pandemic, life and death, suffering and salvation during the coronavirus crisis. The longing for salvation is at the very heart of human existence. Everyone hopes to experience salvation, especially those whose lives are deeply immersed in many phases of suffering and drive them to question the meaning of their life and even their faith in God. The experience of salvation, however, is not something that happens in a vacuum. It is always experienced in and through a particular context. According to the great Dominican theologian Edward Skillebeck, whose method and theological reflections on suffering and salvation I will capitalize on this paper, to experience is to interpret at the same time, using models and concepts, patterns, and categories of one's context. So how do we experience, understand, and communicate salvation amidst the COVID-19 pandemic? This is the attempt that this paper would like to present. And as an attempt, this humble work does not claim any finality. This phenomenological study will adopt Edward Skillebeck's hermeneutics of praxis, a method which seeks to establish the relationship between theory and practice. This method is historical, for it seeks to understand faith in its relation to historical periods. Critical, for it looks critically at elements of distortion in power relations and resisting their future repetition. And practical, for it's not only theoretical, rather a practice in faith. In this paper, we will also uncover experiences and reflections of people who were infected by the disease and those who accompanied them and their families. I was fortunate to have 15 respondents who shared with me the sufferings they went through, their hopes, the way they cope with their losses, and the way they understand salvation amidst the present coronavirus crisis. Experience of suffering. The experiences of suffering shared, especially by those infected, include physical and psychological suffering. Others also suffer social and mobility restrictions, and still others relational, like preventing family members to get infected and the death of a relative or a friend. Undeniably, everyone suffers during the pandemic. Economically speaking, the lockdowns imposed had great damage. But in this journey called life, we're always at the crossroads. There are options to make and new paths to tread, especially those who are left behind. Every step we take towards that journey, we must celebrate life. It's not anymore so much about the dead, rather how those left behind cope with the experience of death, how they see how we see ourselves, how do we move on. That is why the journey through grief and the journey through faith is very important. Looking at life as a journey changes your attitude, your purpose, your vision in life right now. Personally, I feel that these past 2 years I've been sharpened by the thought that this is just a journey and the fullness of life gets confirmed and gets enriched by this experience. Many of the respondents acknowledge that salvation in time of the pandemic is a liberation from danger, sickness, and death, as well as protection from spiritual dryness. Others look at salvation as God's healing touch and loving presence. Others express salvation as seeing the hands of God, ever assuring that these two shall pass, and that He is able to do promise despite everything. And another look at it as the only consolation, especially by those who are infected, and the bereaved families of those who have died, and assurance of peace and joy that our communion with the Holy Trinity. Correspondents considered salvation both as present and eschatological hope as the fullness of life. Skillebeck believes that God's salvation occurs in this world and is intrinsically connected to human experience of wholeness and fullness. He is convinced that salvation from God is realized through human beings and the world. Indeed, Skillebeck's present eschatological hope rests on the realization of the humanum, the true and livable humanity, the fullness of life. It begins in the here and now by working for happiness and goodness of humankind in creation. It ends with eschatological hope, which according to him remains unpredictable, undefinable, a mystery which rests on God's graciously excessive gift. He envisions it as total elimination of suffering from history, reconciliation with living in the dead, and the fullness of life. Thus, view of salvation as fullness of life is not contrary to faith. Even in the New Testament, Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it to the full. How do we then communicate salvation as fullness of life during the pandemic crisis? What are we going to communicate? These are simply a proposal. First, that pandemic is not a scourge of a vengeful God. I remember talking to a lady in her 50s in a public market in Manila, and she said that the pandemic is God's way of reducing people in the world. This may sound ridiculous, but her thoughts is shared by many who considers the pandemic as the punishment from God or a sign of the apocalypse. And whether we like it or not, religion or the way we communicate the image of God has a piece of cake in this. Whenever the immediate causes of a phenomenon is not readily explicable, there's always a human tendency to directly implicate God. All of a sudden, the generous and loving God is turned to a vengeful one. According to biblical scholar J. Goldingay, the story of Job and the other Old Testament stories reflect that one must not always assume that plagues, epidemics, disasters in the scriptures are punishment. According to him, the view that the Old Testament generally makes a tight link between sin and disaster is just a myth. Perhaps because deber, the Hebrew word for a plague or epidemic, commonly has God as a subject, so God is always accused as the one who brings disasters, even if it's not really the case. Hence, the pandemic does not begin with nor places God, neither as part of the ongoing story. The latest report from WHO says that the pandemic is zoonotic in source, although debate on the disease origin remains open. Nonetheless, the pandemic and natural disasters are not punishment from God. The Catechism explains that they are part of nature being in the state of journeying. Even the Filipino Catechism says that it is told from the kind of limited universe in which we live. In January 2020, in the occurrence of succeeding natural calamities locally and globally, the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, or CBCP, released a casual statement that natural calamities are not scourge of the vengeful God. Rather, they are signs that we are still living in an imperfect natural world. The second, that salvation includes the now. One aspect of salvation that still permits in the present consciousness is to regard salvation merely or only as a matter of the afterlife, or reduce its notion simply as salvation of souls. Such is shaped by the dualistic perspective popularized in the Middle Ages that considers the world and the body, together with the devil, as enemies, that nothing was more essential than the soul, only the soul. But prior to its Christian usage, salvation is understood as deliverance from evil, which defined not only as spiritual but also social, political, economic, psychological, demographic, etc. A form of earthly, or shall we say, secular salvation. Salvation is not simply otherworldly. For Skillebeck, it includes liberation from personal, social oppressions and alienations leading an experience of fullness, or the attainment of the humanum, the true and livable humanity, the fullness of life here in the here and now. Furthermore, salvation is universal, as it is a gift from God, the God who is proclaimed as the God of all humanity, the God of all nations, the God of all creation, the God of all religions. Salvation must therefore be communicated as good news to all human beings without discrimination. The fullness of life, after all, is for all religions, and I believe the goal of all religions. Thirdly, salvation includes acts of love offered by science. The ideology that science is opposed to faith still exists today. The thinking that scientific advancements has no place in God's salvific plan still permits. Yes, we do not pay blind eye to the unacceptable processes and inventions that science and technology created, to which the church and other religions also expressed dismay and readily offered fraternal correction. But we also should acknowledge the good things that science and technology has brought to humankind. The pandemic has taught us that science can also contribute to the experience of the fullness of life in the here and the now. The CBCP, at the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, has released several circulars urging the faithful to cooperate in the measures to keep people safe and healthy, like social and physical distancing and abiding to hygiene protocols. Dioceses and parishes were encouraged to have the celebration of the Eucharist and other services transmitted via the internet, television, or radio to continue providing spiritual support to people. Moreover, the development of COVID-19 vaccine gives people hope, and the CBCP joined people around the world in welcoming this advancement. Several senior prelates even volunteered to be among the first ones to be vaccinated to help build trust in the vaccine and eradicate hesitancies and even conspiracy theories. Vaccine hesitancy, perhaps due to lack of information or prevalence of disinformation, is disturbing. That is why Pope Francis encouraged everyone to avail of the vaccine authorized by the respective authorities, calling it an act of love. For love is always social and political. He said, getting vaccinated is a simple yet profound way to care for one another, especially the most vulnerable. In proper perspective, that is, looking at freedom in right context, following good scientific advice for the good of humanity, like abiding health standards, getting the vaccine is a way to experience fullness of life, and also let others experience the same. This is something that we really have to communicate loud and clear. And lastly, salvation includes human solidarity. One of the respondents said that salvation is seeing people assist one another and provide for their needs. The fullness of life cannot be without human solidarity. Goldingay said that although it is not much emphasized, narratives of plagues and epidemic in the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus requires people to give concrete expression of love for their neighbor. As Filipinos, one of our greatest concrete expression of solidarity this pandemic here in the Philippines is the mushrooming of community pantries in different places. As also shared by Father Norman last night, this was initiated by Patricia Non, a 26-year-old entrepreneur. And the reminder, popularized in that Maginhawa community pantry, give what you can, take only what you need, became a banner and call for solidarity. Many individuals and groups also donated PPEs to frontliners and hospitals, offered free counseling services, free seedlings and saplings to those who would like to plant them, known as community pantry, free transportation to those medical frontliners and those with immediate medical attention. However, we do not also discount the fact that during the pandemic, there are also those who took advantage of the situation. Presently, we are also on the lookout on how the pandemic situation in the Philippines will be used for the upcoming national election. Yes, the pandemic has brought out both the best and the worst in us. But as history has shown, the power of human solidarity embedded in our consciousness as Filipinos will always find its way to emerge. Indeed, the community pantries in various forms of solidarity resurrected the spirit of bayanihan, an indigenous Filipino trait, although not peculiar to Filipinos alone. This trait still exists, but has become more pronounced and given more profound meaning due to the experience of the pandemic. To conclude, the pandemic put us in a situation of complex experience. The various forms of suffering evoke hope for a better future. The encounter with death evokes discernment on the meaning of life. The pandemic also made even more pronounced the human solidarity to journey towards the fullness of life. It also enabled us to evaluate our faith in an image of God, the giver of this fullness. The call to experience the fullness of life in the here and the now invites us individually and collectively to follow St. Paul's advice. Rejoice in hope, be patient under trials, persevere in prayer. Until we reach the promised completeness of life's fullness, an unpredictable, undefinable mystery which rests on God's graciously excessive gift. I'd like to end this reflective presentation with this letter shared with me by my former student, Vanessa. This was written by her grandmother, Evelyn, days before she was hospitalized and eventually passed away due to COVID-19. Dear Heavenly Father, today, August 12, 2021, I wrote this letter for you to thank you for the beautiful life you've given me. I consider it, Lord, a perfect one. You have blessed me with so many things, and I could not ask for more. I will continue to trust you and have faith that anything you will bestow upon me will all be beautiful. I love you, Lord, and in Jesus' name I pray. Evelyn. She died on September 16, but her family and I are convinced that Evelyn has finally attained God's gracious gift of the fullness of life, which Saint Paul described as no one has seen, no ear has heard, no human heart has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him. Thank you.